1932, the campaign for the 1932 election. Of course, Hoover, sitting president, is going to be the Republican nominee. The Democrats choose their former vice presidential candidate from back in 1920, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of New York. And they choose him pretty quickly. He kind of runs away with the nomination, easily defeating Al Smith, who was trying to get it again. As a senator state senator from New York, he had opposed the political machinery of Tammany Hall. He was a distant cousin, I think third or fourth cousin, of Teddy Roosevelt, and he had married Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, his favorite niece. That means that Franklin and Eleanor were distant cousins, and Teddy actually gave her away at the wedding. Nonetheless, Roosevelt was a Democrat, and he had been a strong supporter of Woodrow Wilson. And under Woodrow Wilson, Franklin had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is the same position that Teddy Roosevelt had held about 20 years before that. So something else that the Roosevelts have in common. When he had run for vice president, he had not yet been struck by the polio that would leave him crippled later on, unable to walk. That actually struck him the year after that election. And by 1932, he is in fact physically challenged. He has to wear leg braces to stand up. Usually he is in a wheelchair. Although things being the way they were back then, and politicians wanting to exude, a really strong presence, there were very few photographs or movies taken of him in that more vulnerable position. So, 1928, he had been elected governor of New York, and he was in fact the sitting governor of New York when he ran for and got the Democratic nomination. In his campaign, FDR promised the American people a New Deal. He said, well, here's a quote, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. So here again, echoes of Teddy Roosevelt, who had promised a square deal. So now it is a new deal for the American people, who are quite certainly ready for one after several years of this debilitating depression. Roosevelt was supported by such prominent people as William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper man, who actually we had talked about 35 years earlier in the lead up to the Spanish-American War. He's still around and still prominent. Also, the son of Irish-American immigrants, Joseph Kennedy Sr. of Massachusetts, who is, he and his family are going to play a large role in Democratic politics from this point forward. One of the things, among many things that Roosevelt talked about that really got a lot of people's attention was he promised to repeal prohibition. This was, as he presented it, an experiment that failed, and it was time to stop experimenting with it and move on. And a lot of Americans were certainly on board with that. As you can see, Roosevelt pretty well ran away with the election. It was an overwhelming victory. In fact, Hoover had gone from getting 58% of the popular vote in 1928 down to about 40% in 1932. So now it's going to be Roosevelt's turn to take on this depression.
I am glad of this opportunity to extend my deep appreciation to the electorate of this country, which gave me yesterday such a great vote of confidence. It is a vote that had more than mere party significance. It transcended party lines and became a national expression of liberal thought. It means, I am sure, that the masses of the people of the nation firmly believe that there is great and actual possibility in an orderly recovery through a well-conceived and actively directed plan of action. Such a plan has been presented to you, and you have expressed approval of it. This, my friends, is most reassuring to me. It shows that there is in this country unbounded confidence in the future of sound agriculture and of honorable industry.
Roosevelt almost didn't make it to his own inauguration. A little more than 2 weeks before he was scheduled to take office, he was the victim of an assassination attempt. He was in Chicago, appearing at an event along with the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, when Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian-born immigrant, a bricklayer, who had, he had some serious issues with capitalism. He said afterward that he was going to kill the kings and the presidents first and then all the capitalists, and so he tried to start with FDR. However, Giuseppe Zangara was a very unbalanced man. And by that I mean he was really short and he couldn't see over the crowd. So he stood up a metal folding chair and stood up on the chair and lost his balance as he was starting to squeeze off the shots. And he accidentally shot and killed the mayor of Chicago instead, and the president wasn't hit. Zangara was sentenced to the electric chair for first-degree murder after Cermak lingered and died. Some of you may have seen the Amazon Prime series that ran for, 3 or 4 seasons, The Man in the High Castle, based on a classic novel, science fiction novel by Philip K. Dick, which was about, it was an alternate history about an America where Germany had won World War II and conquered the United States. The triggering event, no pun intended, in that alternate reality of that story is that Zangara had been successful in his assassination attempt and had killed FDR before he ever took office. So Roosevelt wasn't there to deal with the issues that came along later. Fortunately, FDR did manage to make it to his inauguration without getting shot, and he did in fact get inaugurated. In fact, some of you probably are already aware of the fact that FDR, by golly, he got inaugurated twice as much as anybody ever had been before, but that's a different story that comes later. His first inauguration went off and he took office, and his administration sort of had a lot of echoes of the progressive era. Remember, he'd been a strong supporter of Wilson during the progressive era. And one of those things, and in particular I'm talking about, is the fact that in the progressive era, government had a high opinion and a reliance on experts. And they'd kind of gotten away from that in the 1920s, but in the 1930s with Roosevelt, that came back. A lot of people that he had as high-level advisors and many members of his cabinet were not only well-educated, but were high-ranking experts in their fields. It was referred to as his brain trust. In other words, he had a monopoly on the brains of the country. And something else that was different about his cabinet was that he appointed the very first woman to ever have a cabinet position in a president's administration, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. Well, he had promised a New Deal, and he had gotten a lot of support in getting him the opportunity to try to carry that out, and that support would carry him through not just that first campaign and that first election, but other elections to come. In effect, he built a coalition referred to as the New Deal Coalition, those different groups of people who coalesced around Roosevelt in support of Roosevelt, who would really become sort of the the framework of the base of the Democratic Party for half a century to come. And some of these groups, some of them you might expect to work together, and some of them not. So you had Southern white voters who supported Democrats, as we saw before. They would support Democrats pretty much no matter what at this point. Poor white people from other parts of the country, labor unions, minorities, several different types of minority groups, and people who lived in the cities. So again, that's kind of a broad spectrum of people that was going to enable him to be successful with their support. And as I said, they would be sort of the basis of the Democratic Party for decades to come. Well, he had gotten elected in part out of a desire of the American people to feel like they had a government and leadership, and especially a president, who was taking action, who was doing something. This depression had been going on for several years. It was really, really rough, obviously, and a lot of people in the U.S. felt like Hoover had been a little bit too removed. You know, he had had that laissez-faire, hands-off approach to government, and it hadn't worked out real well. FDR, when he took office, immediately within the first 3 months or so, instituted several new programs and several new agencies, some of which were successful immediately, some of which didn't work out so well and eventually were abandoned, and at that point they tried something else. But really the point was, right off the bat, to make people feel like something was being done. And in addition to that, Roosevelt had what were called his fireside chats. These fireside chats were weekly radio addresses delivered to the nation, and that was a new thing for presidents, to have sort of this weekly one-on-one thing with the public without being filtered through reporters and so forth. So essentially, the president would sit each week and he would talk about issues and problems of the day, and he would do so in a calm, optimistic, and reassuring manner. That is what led people to call them fireside chats. The idea that it's like you were sitting in the living room with your father or your grandfather who was telling you things that perhaps were very serious, but was doing so in a way that you felt like he had things under control and everything was going to be okay. One of the most important people in the FDR administration was not in the FDR administration. In fact, he wasn't even in the United States. He was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, whose work was extremely influential and grew more influential as the 1930s progressed and as the global Great Depression progressed. In essence, a lot of his work, a lot of his theory was counter to that other famous British economist from the 18th century, Adam Smith, whose theory of allowing free markets and the invisible hand of the market had become very influential in the 18th and 19th centuries, and essentially said that, markets will take care of themselves, that supply and demand, when they meet, you're going to have an effective market, and that in particular labor issues would be resolved when laborers were willing in hard times to accept less money, and then the markets would adjust and everything would sort of work out. Keynes did not take that approach. Here's a quote from him pertaining to that Adam Smith approach, that if everyone is looking after their own interests, that eventually it's going to work against one another and create balance. And so his view of that was, quote, capitalism. I can't do the English accent justice, by the way. Capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. He believed the opposite. He believed that when the economy was bad, instead of accepting less money, workers really should be getting the same money or maybe even more money because they need to have money to spend. Because in the consumer culture that really the Western world had become by the 20th century, that had become paramount. He believed that if the amount of money that is saved by people exceeds the amount of money being invested, that's going to cause unemployment. That's sort of the idea that if all the wealth is tied up and not being spent, then the mechanism of consumer society is going to get bogged down. Demand outweighs supply. Smith said, supply and demand work together, but here's the problem. Keynes was essentially saying, it doesn't matter how much supply you have if there's no demand, and there's not going to be demand for the goods if there's not enough wealth or not enough money to go around. And so what is required is not less money, but more money. In essence, what Keynesian economics proposes kind of goes against the old adage that you should run the economy or you should run the government the way that you run your household, the way that you budget your family, which is to say that when times are hard, you save money and spend less. That's sort of the natural inclination to take. Keynes, however, was saying that that is going to make the problem worse, and that when you're dealing with the government trying to regulate an economy and keep an economy going, that when the economy's bad, that's when the government needs to spend money. Because as the government spends money, it is injecting that money back into the system, back into the economy. And it's kind of like priming the pump on a well. In order to get the water flowing, you pour a little bit into it. So FDR, in his administrations, started applying some of these principles, and so did other capitalist countries around the world. So that particularly by the post-World War II era, this was kind of this had become sort of the most widely accepted economic theory. It's going to be challenged later on, beginning in the 1950s. But for now, this is what you need to remember about John Maynard Keynes and his approach. Well, first you need to remember he's a British economist, but essentially, when the economy's bad, the government needs to spend money. That's the Keynesian approach.